种族纲目，恰的种族纲目，少三下来压的是，特人讲的民族，历当讲的内容在一起。
정말이야 삼투자 시대에 나가도 될래 가리라의 코에 신간데 편한 대화만을 중에 제네서와 딘생게도 샤베시게 봐도 대인교 직스. Of course, yeah, this topic is very important, and with the same things for a long time, particularly our these regions, we are of course not interested to talk about the Dalai Lamas, or somehow we are afraid to talk about the Dalai Lamas and the Tibetans issue related with the Dalai Lamas. So I think it's very important, as well as I would like to congratulate the organizers and coming up with the courage to organize this very important. So with these words, I would like to start with my presentations. And of course, you can read my presentation in English as well as in Tibetan. When it comes to the both presentations, when I was nervous, I will speak very fast, so please do remind me, slow down, whoever in between they would like to me to listen in slowly. So when it comes to the presentations, my presentation board language is somehow that when I was a young student in Varanasi, the former official translator of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the former director of the Tibet House, the late Thubten, visited Varanasi, and he gave a talk that I would like to give a talk in English because I know that well-versed Tibetan students are here and scholars, so I can hide my weakness in English. So somehow I'm doing the same thing here. Of course, I would like to present in Tibetan because it will be much easier for me. Somehow I'm doing and presenting this in English so that I can hide my weakness in English. But somehow, if anyone's have questions with the presentations in Tibetan as well as English, please do raise questions afterward. So of course, from the titles you can read, it is the Tibetan sources, how far it can be traced into English about the lineages of the 6th Dalai Lama's mother families, particularly the Ber mKhar lineages. Of course, here I'm excluding the father's lineages, which belongs to the Nye or Nye family from the lineages tracing back to the Patmalingba in Bhutan. Could you please go to the next slide? So this is the brief contents of my presentations. Of course, yeah, can you go back next? The first one, yeah. Of course, as I was a student, one of my teachers or professor in Delhi, he told me that always consider that your listeners were completely new to your presentation. So it's very important to introduce with the regions or whatever topic I'm talking, with a really from simple to a little bit deeper. And then I have a briefly historical introductions of the regions, how it was before it became part of the Gandhi Photang in the late 17th century. And then I have a main parts, of course, then short conclusions. Please, next. So this is the map, and I focused it only from the before when it was part of the India in 1951. So we have on the west Bhutan, in the east, of course, the current Arunachal Pradesh, and in the north we have Tibet. And it is highly connected with Sonazong and Jorazong before 1951. So you can look at the left side also. Sorry. And then could you please go to the next slide? So when it comes to my theoretical as well as methodological approach to the current topics, it is somehow, could you go please to the previous one? Oh, can you please stop the automatic one so that it will stop here? So it's here, yeah. So it is simply from ethno-historical reconstructions of regions based on oral as well as written sources. So in my case, I have focused very much on the written Tibetan sources. And secondly, the theoretical or methodology is somehow based on the written sources and oral sources, but it tried to show our written sources to make help of those non-literate societies. Of course, the Mon region was non-literate, but somehow I'm trying to impose on that because written Tibetan sources are very rare. We observe that mostly it is written in Tibetan from central Tibet, and the document issues from the Lhasas in the old time. And then the last part is my introduction, so the paper which I will write later on, it will simply a descriptive so that people will follow it easily and nicely. and it will become like a part of a story. So could you please go to the next one? I think we have jumped one slide. Yeah, then next, please. Yeah, this map shows. Yeah, this one. This one here. Yeah. So yeah. So I have a brief introductions of the regions and focusing along with the Eastern Bhutans and Bhutan. So if you go through the history of the regions, we will find that almost all the ruling elites or ruling leaders of the regions trace it back to their ancestors to the Tibetan emperor prince in the late 8th and the 9th centuries. And when it comes to focusing particularly on this one region, including the West Kameng districts, we found many royal lineages. Of course, they tried to trace it back to the same single princess called Prince Tsangma. And when it comes to the different lineages, then we have here Ber mKhar royal lineages. Of course, they also trace back to the 9th century Tibetan prince called Tsangma. Then we have a different sources where it mentions that, of course, the prince could be not Tsangma than other, tracing it back to the 8th century. And of course, then, due to the rise of the religious spiritual leaders, then those Tibetan those local rulers will shift their positions when it comes to the new spiritual rulers. Of course, when it comes to Sakya and Kagyu, then in the 16th century with the rise of Gelugpas, most of those local rulers shifted their alliance or their practices or their sponsorship to the rulings or the risings Gelugpa schools in the 6th centuries. So with the rise of religious leaders in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, then we have some dominant Gelugpa lamas from these regions. In the mid or late 16th century, we have Lama Thubten, of course, local people know it very well. Then we have Merak Lama, who has, with the order, with the help of the 5th Dalai Lama, founded Tawang Monastery, Lama Lode Gyatso, and of course the 6th Dalai Lamas. This is a short or brief introductions of the regions. And next, I think we have left on map. Yes. So this map which briefly shows how those Tibetan princes in the late 8th and the 9th century traveled from the central Tibet and down to the Mon regions in that periods. So this map, particularly the red line, shows the Prince Tsangmas. Suppose he took that road from the western parts of Bhutan to the central, southern, and then eastern parts of current Tawang and Mon regions, and most of his lineages trace back here. Let's do the next. Yeah, then when it comes to the main part of my presentation, it is, of course, written Tibetan sources, the first part, oral sources, of course, in Tibetan as well as local dialects or local languages. And then I have a very controversial or very discussions to be made in later on why our 6th Dalai Lama families were not given the title of Yapshis and instead of Kushang or Kushang's Depa. So let's go to the next part, which is, of course, now we are going to talk about the central figure, which is the 6th Dalai Lamas. And I have taken this photo long time back in 2013. And in the left side below, this figure is the 6th Dalai Lama's mother, and the right side is the Yap Tashi Tenzin. Next. So now when it comes to the written sources, there are many written sources which we can be categorized into different parts. And of course, could you please go to next? Yeah. Yeah, next one, number 9, please. Yeah, we have written sources, chronicles, annals, which is more or less same, and different. And below we have our religious histories. So when it comes to the chronological analysis, then we have a Chejung Gefe Khatun, Depte Ngombo, Lorong Chejung, Depte Chigi Gameluyang, and Dio Chejung. All these texts have mentions that some lineages are available or can be found in the Eastern Bhutan as well as Mon regions. And it didn't mention which lineages it can be traced. And it didn't mention the name of the particular ruling princess was at those times. And when it comes to the religious history, Chejung texts, then of course we have two important texts here, which is particularly the first text, Men Chejung or Gyaltrik Chungung Sewe Dolme. This Gyaltrik text or the Men Chejung, which was published from Lhasa in 1987, and then the Gyaltrik, more or less these texts are same, but there are at least 10 different Dima, the manuscripts, handwritten, which can be found in Eastern Bhutan as well as in Tawang as well as in West Khammyr districts. So there are at least two observations and articles written on this text, and the differences between those different manuscripts. And we observe that very few lineages are missing in those texts, and rest more or less same. And interesting parts is this text is that almost all those Dima or the manuscripts has written down the Ber mKhar lineages up to the early 18th century, whether it is from Bhutan textual sources or from the Tawang as well as West Khammyr textual sources. Then we have Gawe Peltet, which records about the 4 Merak Lamas from the Tawangs. And of course, in this text also it mentions about Ber mKhar lineages. And then we have Ganden Chojung, which is written by the Desi Sangye Gyatso. Of course, it mentions about Tawang Monastery as well as lineages of 6th Dalai Lama and the Ber mKhar family. Then we have Longjin Chojung. Of course, it doesn't mention directly about Ber mKhar lineages, but it mentions about lineages exist in the Tawang region as well as in the Bhutan. Could you go back to the next one? Then, of course, we have an autobiography or Rangnam or Namthar. In these texts, particularly Pema Lingba's Rangnam mentions about existence of a local rurals in the Seru Tso in these Tawang regions, but it doesn't mention about the Ber mKhar lineages. It is quite interesting, and he mentions about the relationship between local ruler from Seru with the Jayul Deba. Jayul Deba was once the main ruling part in the southeastern central part of Tibet during the Sakya lineage, or during Sakya hegemony in central Tibet. Then we have Merak Lama Zainam, which is the first Merak Lamas from Tawang regions, and it mentions about the Ber mKhar lineages, as well as he mentions about Tangdong Gyabo visit to these regions. And then we have Nawe Chulen and Dukulai Tote. Both these texts are the biography of the 6th Dalai Lama written by the Desi Sangye Gyatsos. Nawe Chulen is a little bit shorter versions, and Dukulai Tote is the detailed versions, which is around 600 pages. If someone would like to read through the 6th Dalai Lama biographies, it's very interesting and is highly well-written Tibetan sources. And then we have Yoga Chingi Tengwa, which is the biography of the 5th, or the autobiography of the 5th Panchen Lama, which mentions about Ber mKhar lineage as well as 6th Dalai Lama's biography after the 1701, because the Sangye Gyatso doesn't mention anything about 6th Dalai Lama's after 1701, and which is very important. Once we want to go through 6th Dalai Lama's full biographies, reading the 5th Panchen Lama biography is very important in this case. Then we have Jayan Shebe Namthar, or the Rangnam. Of course, he was the founder of the Ladang Tushik Hill in currently Qinghai province or in Amdo, and he was a contemporary of the 6th Dalai Lamas, and he has mentioned details about 6th Dalai Lama, particularly after the 1701, where his Desi Sangye Gyatso has not mentions about him. And of course, there are two students from 6th Dalai Lamas. It's very important to note through those sources to note about the Ber mKhar lineages as well as 6th Dalai Lama's lives after the 1701. And then we have local archive documents, which of course I'm able to find from the local sources, and I'm not supposed to mention those sources. But some of these two sources I'm going to introduce here and very important, which were issues from the Potala Palace, which means the Central Tibetan government in that period, and which were issues from the highest authority 7th Dalai Lama as well as 8th Dalai Lamas and the regions at those periods in the 19th centuries. Next. And then when it comes to the oral sources, of course, I am grateful to the many local public leaders, as well as public figures, and the name I have mentioned here, like the late Tashi Khandula, late Kamawangchula, late Thubten Sembala, as well as the late former Gyalwa Rinpoche from the southern Monyul sides. Then my not only interviewing and directly asking questions, but kind of interactions with them, those lineages, which helped me to assemble sources, I always found out the local sources or any kind of written sources. Like I was able to talk with many ruling of the local regions, not only to the Ber mKhar, but traveling down to the Dirang as well as Bomdila and Shedrubling region, as well as Morsing and Kalaktang. So they really helped me to make or find our sources related to the Ber mKhar lineages. Yeah, then of course former abodes of Tawang monasteries and 2 former Tawang monastery abodes, as well as Lama Ngamon and many other former lamas of the Tawang monasteries, which of course not only Tawang lamas from the southern part of the Mon region also, which helped me to reconstruct the historical lineage as well as find out sources to the particular topics. So this is oral sources and the introduction to the textual sources. So with the help of these sources, I'm able to reconstruct, of course, it's majorly based on the textual sources, to the local Ber mKhar lineages. So the next slide is the Ber mKhar lineages. So if we have a look at the look at the lineages, of course, the Prince Sangma was the brother of the last 2 Tibetan emperors, Tirebachan or the Langdharma, Udum Tsempo. So other texts, many texts have a different who was the eldest. Either it could be the Tirebachan or the Prince Sangma or the of course Langdharma is the younger one comparing to these 2 brothers. So the interesting part is that most of the sources, they trace these lineages to the Tibetan prince called Tsangma. But we have a Desi Sangye Gyatso written history of the biography of the 6th Dalai Lama. It has clearly mentioned that the Ber mKhar lineages trace back to King Kikharathu. So, of course, we have many local dissidents here. They claim that, not only in here in Tawang region, in Eastern Bhutan, they claim that we belong to the Kikharathu dissidents. And if you happen to talk with here in Jang regions and in the Sharso Valley in Shadnup, you will find that some family have a surname or title as a Ki or K. So which means that they trace their lineages back to the Kikharathu. So I think that when it comes to the composition of text period, if we consider the Galtric text or the Menchujung as 1668, which John Arducy from America, he thinks that text was composed or compiled in 1668. According to that period, then Prince Sangma can be the sources of the lineages. But if we consider the text, the Menchujung text period as 1728, which Michael Harris has considered, and I myself have think that 1720 is more accurate and more alignable with the name mentions in Menchujung text. 1728 is more reliable. And of course, I think that this is Sangye Gyatso's mentionings of Kikharathu as the source of the lineage is more accurate, because at the time he was the regent or he was the emperor or king of that period, so he can command a lot of sources, local sources. So that could be the main reason. Somehow, so we have now 2 sources these lineages can be traced. So I have simply put the Prince Sangma or Kikharathu as the 0, and then we have up to the last current descendants, we have tracing it back to 29 generations. So which is quite an interesting, and these lineages can be traced back to up to the 9th centuries. So interesting parts about Desi Sangye Gyatso is that he didn't mention the first 2 lineages sources. He simply go down to the Gongkarjes as the source of his first descendants, which can be traced in the Mon regions. then he mentions direct father to son descendants, and he simply ignored the other brothers and siblings of the mKhar lineages. But the Menchojung text has clearly mentions the sibling as well as siblings, other sons and the other lineages. So from the Gongache, we can trace it back up to the Jowo Darge, which is at the end of the first slide. So in between, when it comes to the Jowo Darge, then he has 3 sons, so which is around the 14th and early 16th centuries. So Jowo Darge has 3 sons. The middle one becomes a monk, and he has the title of Chose. And then this mKhar lineage is traced into 2 families, Upper mKhar and Lower mKhar. From my understandings, the current descendants or the current family in the day before yesterday we have visited belongs to the Lower mKhar house. So my reason is that Upper mKhar house has 2 descendants after the founding of the Upper mKhar house. That is, then we have, I could not see it clearly from here. I will read it. So when it comes to the upper founder of the mKhar, then we have Jowo Darge. So Sajjan has 3 sons. So first was Sangye Dakpa, and the middle was Chonje and Dargis. So Darge was the founder of the Upper mKhar house, and he has only 1 son, according to the Desi Sangye Gyatso. And when it comes to the Menchojung, it mentions about Jowo Darge as well as Tashi Sangbo as the 2 sons. So Jowo Darge has 2 children, and both of them are Tawang Hamo, singularly it mentions in Menchojung. While it comes to the Desi Sangyo biographies, it mentions Tawang Hamo as well as Tashi Sangbo as the 2 children from the Jamyang Dorji. So here interesting part is that if we look at the Menchojung and the Desi Sangye Gyatso's text, Menchojung compiler or the writer has simply omitted the Tawang Hamo names in the text because at the time there was a political tension as well as social tensions. So if we look at the parallel to the Lower mKhar house, we have Jowo Karma as well as Punsok and Zombawang. And then we can trace one more son of the Zombawang, Jowo Sita, which I have mentioned in the right side of the slide or the family trees, where Jowo Sita is mentioned. So if Jowo Sita can be mentioned as Menchojung, why not Tawang Hamo? Because in Menchojung, Tashi Sangbo is mentioned, but Tashi Sangbo name is not mentioned. He was simply mentioned as title, Jowo Depa. So Jowo Depa comes from the ruler or the lord from the Tibetans, a political point of view or Tibetan political history. So interesting part is that, of course, if Tawang Hamo name is omitted in the Menchojung, so it omitted the 6th Dalai Lama's name in the Menchojung also. Because I consider that Menchojung was compiled in the 728 because the political situation as well as the text titles or the compilation of the page particularly aligned at there. So then I have mentioned other names where I have mentioned from the Jowo Nazum sides. Jowo Nazum or Jowo Zombawang is mentioned in the Menchojung, and Jowo Nazum is mentioned in the Desi Sangye Gyatso's biography. So then we have other sources, names which can be found on the Tibetan legal ethics issues in the 1752 by the 7th Dalai Lama, which was reaffirmed by the 8th Dalai Lamas in 1799. So we have Dundup or Dundup Richen, Hawang Gyalbo, Tawang Dundup, Kelsang Sonam Gyume, and Sonam Dundup. And then we have Kelsang Yishi Chumbel and Wang Bo and Lama Tsokni. Lama Tsokni is currently a monk in Tawang Monastery. If anyone interested, you can talk with him or ask with him. And then we have Yishi Chumbel. Yishi Chumbel has 2 or 3 children. So from Yishi Chumbel, then we have lineages trace it back to the current Lower mKhar house. So of course, this is based on textual sources, and there are little bit different narratives from the oral sources also. They mentions that, of course, some of those lineages can be aligned with the Paodungba lineages also. So my next slide shows the Jawa Nazoms. This is in Tibetan. Of course, the script is distorted here. Next, please. Next. Here is the edict issued by the 7th Dalai Lama in 1752, which means just 1 year after when 7th Dalai Lama assumes the political and temporal powers in the 1751. So interesting part of this edict is that from 1730 to 1751, of course, the 7th Dalai Lama was fully recognized and has the title of political and temporal ruler of Tibet, but somehow he can't stay in Lhasa due to the strong influence from the regent Desi Pholane Sonam Topkes. So when you look at the Desi Pholane, these edicts, we have the red square seals, which is the 2 golden seals in the name of Dalai Lama issued by the Chinese emperor. So which clearly mentions that I'm issuing these issues in the name of the Potala pilots and the authority with the 7 Dalai Lamas to the Ber ruling families. And he mentions at least 3 dissidents name of the Ber ruling families. And the below one from the red scroll is the edict is reaffirmed by the 8th Dalai Lama. He clearly mentioned that the edict which is issued by the former 7th Dalai Lama, I am reaffirming whatever the privileges obtained or gained by the Ber families. Could you go to the next slide? So this slide mentions about the details in the Tibetans as well as English translations. Promo one, please. And I have highlighted in the blue color, green color, which are the names which is mentioned in the edicts and which I have written down in the family trees. And who were the issuers and how it is related to the Ber families I have highlighted in yellow colors. So of course I have mentioned, highlighted the dates on which date it was issued and something like that. Could you go to the next one? After this edict by the 7th Dalai Lama, which was the 8th Dalai Lama, then I have another edict which was similarly mentions about the 6th Dalai Lama's Ber family and tracing it back to the Gyaltsang Dönye, and his family should even or can enjoy all the privileges which was given by the former 7th Dalai Lama. And this edict has been reaffirmed or reiterated 4 times by the regent Tibetans. So here you will find the Rating Rinpoche as well as Tsimoleng Rinpoches and then Kundeling Tatsak Rinpoches. So all these were edicts or reaffirmed. The first one is 1837 and which was reiterated in 1839. So 1839 it is reiterated by the Tibetan cabinet, Kashaks. And then we can trace it back to the above 1849, which was reaffirmed by the third Rating Rinpoches, and third Rinpoches again reaffirmed it when the new Dalai Lama came up in the power, that the 12th Dalai Lama, and then finally it was reaffirmed by the Kundeling Tatsak in 1882. So all this edict shows that the Ber lineages is true to its ancestral lineages which they claim, and they are able to claim their privileges at those times, and which was issued and reaffirmed by the highest authority at that time, which means from the Potala pilots from different Tibetan ruling regent as well as the Dalai Lamas. Could you go with the next one? So this is text which I have written down in Tibetan as well as English. Here, could you go at the pictures? These pictures, from my point of view, I'm saying that these two are the only thing which are directly related to the 6th Dalai Lamas. Of course, I'm not negating any spiritually deed or spiritually established any kind of sources which we have gone through and we have visited in the last several days. So the first was the Ukeling temples, and the second was the urn of the 6th Dalai Lama families, which is preserved in the Tawang monastery's main hall. The next one. So the question comes of the Yapshis. So why not the families were given the title or ranked in the Yapshis? In my understanding, of course, the families were given the Yapshis because The father passed away just some months before when Dalai Lama was enthroned in 1697. Because the mother enjoys with many privileges and having a Shedrubling as new family's properties in central Tibet, in southeast Tibet. So, of course, and I'm also wondering about, in 1731, Desi Pholana had issued an edict to Tawang monasteries, and which reaffirmed the Tawang monastery privileges given by the 5th Dalai Lama in 1681. But he didn't mention anything about 6th Dalai Lama as well as the Ber mKhar families. So I'm just wondering about Desi Pholana has any knowledge about Ber mKhar families and 6th Dalai Lama. Of course, there's a political tensions at those times. Next, please. So this is my final conclusions. So which talks about, of course, with the narrations and the tracing it back to Ber mKhar lineages, I'm trying to figure out the social and political situations at that time, and at the same time I'm trying to figure out the local histories. And of course the issue raised about the Yapshi's titles, how is the Yapshi titles were given, whether it should be only from the father side or why not it should not be from the mother side. In my understanding, of course, it is from the mother side also, but we hardly find sources which mentions the 6th Dalai Lama families were given the titles of Yapshis. My understanding still is that because 6th Dalai Lama has two siblings, two sisters, and one of the sisters is married to the Jayul Deva's families. So in my understanding that probably they had continued those Yapshis privileges in central Tibet at those times. Of course, then my understanding is that how important the current Ber mKhar families lineages in the current situations, how we have to look at those times or currently. So with those words, I would like to conclude here. Thank you for your attention as well as any questions and criticisms. Most welcome. Thank you very much. I would just like to thank for Professor Tsangyang for giving me a further information about in this regards. Of course, he has made clear how the Yapshi titles were given during those periods. Of course, he has mentioned that only it started from the 7 Dalai Lamas. Of course, and the question arises why the titles given as a Kushang Devas at that time, because text clearly mentions Jo Deva as well as Kushang Devas. So of course, then question comes, it only mentions in the 7 Dalai Lama edicts. And when it comes to the estates with the Kushang Deva's titles, Sangri, of course, Professor has mentioned Sangri. While I was reading through the Dukulai Todes, I have clearly seen Shedrubling also as privileges to the. Of course, I have misread it also. They can clarify. Other scholars are here, so I will be thankful and helpful in this case.
Thank you very much to both speakers. The presentations were very interesting. Very short question to Lobsang and Bala. Could you explain the meaning of the name Parkar? Because Par doesn't look really Tibetan. Do you know the etymology? Do you know the meaning of this name?
Of course, there are two orthographies with regards to Ber mKhar. In some textual sources, which is written with Sango, Sapadaba, with A vowel and Ra, Ber. And then here I have taken down only simply the Ber mKhar. But I really don't know any meanings of this. Of course, I will welcome any other scholars have any definitions for the Bers. Any definitions? Sorry.
Dr. Tenpa, this is regarding the genealogies presentation that you have given. When you were saying about the genealogy of the two lineages, about the Princess Tsangma, and then another was the Khigaraze. If please kindly correct me, if Khigaraze is also referred to sometimes as Kepo Kalawangpo, is it the same or another thing? And then another question is still just beyond that, is the Kalawangpo's history of Tawang, Manjul region, is considered to be the king of Manjul. Do you consider that as a history or as a mystery? That is also the next question.
Of course, Maling Sarji, I don't want to be involved here. I think it is, of course, our history, but due to the very long time and not written sources, it become kind of a legend in between. Of course, when we go through the textual sources, there is a mention of a kingdom called Mentsegel. So we think that probably that is related with the King Kala Ongpo. But it's very difficult to pinpoint the time of his King Kala Ongpo. When we go through the King Kala Ongpo Khandro Doa Sangma Namta, the textual sources, it mentions Tembe de lo Tong Dang Che, which means half and thousands. So which can be, we can approximately can be put it into the 10th centuries. And of course, but our local history as well as legends, they trace it back to the contemporary to the Tibetan Emperor Songtsen Gampo, so which means 7th centuries. So of course, there's not many differences in the time period. So when it comes to the Kikarato and King Kalongpo, it's completely two different. King Kalongpo is a local king, and Kikarato is a prince of the Tibetan Emperor Trisong Dezens, who was in the 8th centuries, middle 8th centuries. So King Kikarato is a very historical figure, which we will find in mentions in many of Tibetan textual sources, of course in Bhutan also. But Bhutan, due to the Tibetan Pema Lingpas mentioning him in a treasure text, Kembalungs. So he became a legend figure there, but still, with the help of Tibetan textual sources, he is a historical figure. Due to his ugly figures, so Tibetan textual sources mention him as with a dog mouth and skulls of gods, something like that. Thanks.
And my next question is Dr. Lobsang Tenpa. As you said that even today we can meet the descendant of the mother of Tsangyang Gyatso. As you also mentioned that one name of Lama, who is there at Tawang monastery. And can I ask, is there any descendant of the father of Tsangyang Gyatso? And we know Tsangyang Gyatso is the descendant of Tibetan Pema Lingpa. So I would like to ask a question, because you studied very well and you researched very well. Today, can we meet one particular family or person who is the descendant of the father of Tsangyang Gyatso? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Again, it is there are textual sources as well as oral traditions. So of course, I'm not negating the oral sources as well as claims on that Ugen Lingpa's lineages or new lineages in Tawang regions. But when it comes to the textual sources, we can clearly see that Yap Tashi Tenzin has only one son and two daughters. And one doctors, we really don't know what happened. And of course, a few days back, I was able to talk with some scholars here, and he clearly mentioned one doctor died in Tibet during those periods. But from the textual sources, it mentions that one doctor married to Jayul Deba in Jayul Zong. So we can say that from the doctor lineages, a new lineage or Ugen Lingpa family keep on, because in the Tibetan traditions, doctor marriages to another family or royal family or aristocrat family continue the lineages. We can take an examples from Sarong families of the current in the 20th and early 21st centuries. Sarong families descendants died out in between the male lineages. With the help of doctors, the lineages keep on. So these kinds of traditions in Tibetan accepted very well. So which means that we cannot ignore those who claim the lineages. Somehow we can say that lineages continue. But when it comes to the male descendants, at those periods, we observe that Yap Tashi Lingpa has two sibling sisters. So we can say that two sibling sisters had also continued the lineages in the period, in the current local area also. And of course, we have Sangye Lingpa lineages also in the textual sources, which clearly mentions. Of course, they trace back to the new lineages, but they continue another temples, Sangye Ling. So Sangye Ling lineage continue also. But somehow we should not ignore in the Dugulai Tote, it mentions that Ugen Lingpa families were driven out from these regions to central Tibet by the, I'm sorry to mention, by the lower Ber mKhar families during those political tensions at that time. So of course maybe they moved to the central Tibet during those period when the region was calm here, because when we look at the 1731 edict issue by the Desi Pholane, it clearly mentioned that the region was very calm here when there was a lot of turmoil in central Tibet in the early 2 decades of the early 18th centuries. So the number of monks rises from 250 to 500 in Tawang monastery in the early 18th centuries, 3 decades. So which means that the time was cool here, so maybe the family moved back here and they continue the lineages. But of course, those current descendants who claim as a descendants as with the titles of new lineage or Ugen Lingpa, they could not produce any documents at the current period. But we cannot acknowledge that they can't be, because maybe we will find documents from somewhere in later on period. Thank you very much.